In the last video, we implemented update profile page using template driven form. The form fields are pre-populated, validations are working, and we got form data in user object. The only issue that we had in this implementation is that pre-selection of status select element is not happening when the page is initially loaded. In app.component.ts, in the user object constructor, we have provided the status data as employed, and the expectation is that in the status drop-down list, employed option should be pre-selected. In app.component.html, if we look into select element, we have not implemented two-way data binding. Let us see what happens if two-way data binding is included. I am enclosing ng model with square and normal brackets, then including its value as user.status. Let us check how it works after two-way data binding. I am saving the file. After the page reload, the status drop-down is blank. Let me try to explain the reason why blank is selected, but before that we should know how object comparison works in JavaScript. For demonstrating this comparison, I have included a code snippet in status.ts. I have defined a variable named status1 with data type as status. For this variable, I have created a new status object with id as 2 and name as employed. In the next line, I have defined another variable named status2. For this as well, I am creating a new status object with id as 2 and name as employed. Notice that both status1 and status2 is having same data. In the next line, I have included a console log that prints the result of comparing the objects of status1 and status2 using double equals operator. Try to guess whether this console log will print true or false. I am saving the file. Let me go to the browser. After the page reload, in the developer console, we can see false printed. Going back to Visual Studio Code, we can see that comparing two objects using double equals is returning false even though the data is same. So in what scenario does JavaScript object comparison results in true? Let me try to answer this scenario. I am creating a third variable named status3 and assigning it with status2. In the next line, I am including a console log to compare and print comparison of status2 and status3. I am saving the file. After the page reload, we can see false printed first and true printed next. Going back to Visual Studio Code, we can see that this comparison has resulted in true. Now let me try to explain how object comparison works in JavaScript. Status2 and status3 variables refers to the same object created in this line, hence it results in true. Status1 contains a new object created using status class constructor. Status2 contains another new object created using status class constructor. Status1 and status2 occupies its own memory space and those are different objects. Hence it results in false even though the data is same. This is how JavaScript compares objects, and it does not do the comparison based on the object properties and values. Now let us come back to understand the reason why status drop-down list is not pre-selected based on two-way data binding. These status objects created and included in the array is what is used to display the options in the status drop-down list. Each option element of the select element is mapped to the respective status object. As two-way data binding is included in the select element, it becomes a necessity to make an item selected in the drop-down, so each one of this status object is compared with the status object created in app.component.ts. Based on this object comparison demonstration provided just now, we can say that each one of this comparison is going to result in false. Since no match is found, it results in blank selection in the drop-down list. Hope this explanation helps you to understand why blank was displayed in the status drop-down. To resolve this issue, we can provide a customized function that compares the status objects in the way we want. In app.component.html, I am including compareWith attribute within square brackets having value as compareStatus. Here, compareStatus is going to be the customized function that will compare status objects in the customized way that we want it to be compared. Let me proceed ahead and define this function in app.component.ts. I am including the function name as compareStatus. Then I am defining the first parameter of this function as status1 of type status and the second parameter as status2 of type status. This function should return a boolean. Within the function body, I am including an if condition that applies AND operator on status1 and status2 objects. Within this if condition, I am including another if condition that checks if the ID of status1 and status2 matches. In this if condition, I am defining that I want the status objects to be compared based on ID property value. If the ID property values of two status objects matches, I decide that the status objects are same. This is the customized comparison that I want to make. If the status object's ID property value matches, I am returning true. After all the if conditions, I am returning false. Now the necessary coding to make the pre-selection of status drop-down list is completed. We can check if it works. I am saving the file. After the page reload, we can see employed option selected in the status dropdown. I will go to app.component.ts and modify the status ID from 2 to 3 and I am saving the file. After the page reload, we can see entrepreneur selected in the status dropdown. We can see that based on the ID of status object, the respective item in the drop-down is getting selected. Let me go back to app.component.ts and revert back the ID as 2 and then saving the file. By including the comparison function, we have made the status drop-down have the respective status option pre-selected when the page is initially loaded. Now let me explain the coding that we have implemented in detail. In angular.io, I have opened the documentation of ngModel directive. In this documentation, under the See Also section, we can see RadioControlValueAccessor and SelectControlValueAccessor. These are additional directives provided by Angular to manage setting value in radio button element and select element. The other form elements apart from radio button and select does not need any special mechanism to set the form element value. When radio button is used Angular internally includes the directive RadioControlValueAccessor, and if select element is used, it internally creates SelectControlValueAccessor. Since radio button and select element needs special ways to set and get values, Angular has provided these directives. We are currently interested in setting the select element, hence I am clicking on SelectControlValueAccessor. Under the properties section, we can see compareWith property defined, which is what we have used in the select element as attribute. Let me go back to Visual Studio Code and highlight that we have included compareWith as an attribute in the select element. Coming back to the documentation, the data type of compareWith is defined as a function, and this function should have two parameters and should return a boolean. That is why we defined the compareStatus function with the required method signature. Let me show that in Visual Studio Code. In app.component.ts, we defined compareStatus function with two parameters and return type as boolean. Coming back to the documentation of SelectControlValueAccessor, through compareWith property, it provides us an opportunity to define our own customized function to compare objects. Let me come back to Visual Studio Code. We already know that two-way data binding tries to select an element from the drop-down list. To select an item from the drop-down list, it compares each status object from status.ts with the status object created in app.component.ts. So whenever this comparison happens, internally Angular will call the function defined in compareWith to compare the status objects. As we have defined compareWith having value as compareStatus, it will call the compareStatus function in app.component.ts whenever comparison needs to be done. When calling the compareStatus function, Angular passes the status object from array as the first parameter and the object created in app.component.ts as the second parameter. If the compareStatus function returns true, Angular takes it as the objects are matching. If the function returns false, Angular takes it as objects are not matching. For whichever item the match is found, the respective option element will get selected in the drop-down list. Now that we have understood the significance of compareWith and compareStatus, now we will understand the logic within the compareStatus function. I am including a console log before the if condition that prints the content of the parameters status1 and status2. Both status1 and status2 is converted into JSON text using the built-in function json.stringify. A pipe character is concatenated between status1 and status2 as a separator. I am saving the file. After the page reload, if we look into the console, we can see multiple lines printed, and in each line status1 and status2 is printed having pipe character as separator between them. All these entries that I am highlighting using mouse is what is printed by the console log included just now in compareStatus function. There are 11 entries, and it means that Angular has internally called compareStatus function 11 times. We know that whatever printed before the pipe character is status1 and whatever printed after the pipe character is status2. As mentioned earlier, status1 always contains the status object of the drop-down list that is defined in status.ts. status2 is either undefined or null or the employed status object. I am still unclear why undefined or null gets passed for object comparison. Let us not worry about that. Wherever status is not null or not undefined, we can see only employed status object. As mentioned earlier, status2 contains the status object created in app.component.ts. Let me show that in Visual Studio Code. Here we can see the status object created for the user object is what is passed as status2. From the browser console output, we can understand how Angular internally calls compareStatus function multiple times to compare the status objects and how the status objects are getting passed as parameters. Coming back to Visual Studio Code, now we will understand the logic that we have within the compareStatus function. In the browser console, we saw that status2 can be undefined or null. As I said earlier, I don't know the reason why it is passed as undefined or null, but we now know that there is a possibility that either status1 or status2 can be null or undefined. Let us assume that we only have the inner if condition. Then the inner if condition will be directly executed and it will check for status1.id equal to status2.id, and in this scenario, if status2 is undefined, it fails and the function execution stops abruptly. As this results in an error, we may not get the expected results from the compareStatus function. To avoid this scenario, we have included the first condition status1 and status2. If any one of the object is undefined or null, this if condition results in false, so the subsequent if block is not executed and it finally returns false and does not result in an error. If status1 and status2 has proper objects, then the outer if condition will be true. Then the inner if condition will be executed and then status ID comparison will happen without any errors. The outer if condition helps to protect the inner if condition in case either status1 or status2 is null or undefined. Hope this clarifies why we have included these if conditions. If we look into the browser console, the main comparison happens in the last two entries. In this entry, the first status object from the array is compared with the employed status object. It should result in false since the ID property values does not match. In the next entry, the second status object from the array is compared with the employed status object and it results in true as both the value of ID property is 2. Once the match is found, it does not check with subsequent array items, hence we don't see the comparison of the third object. Going back to Visual Studio Code and changing the status object ID value from 2 to 1. I am saving the file. After the page reload, if we look into the browser console, we can see only the first object comparison is made. As the ID of the first object comparison matches, subsequent comparisons are not made. Let me try to change the value from 1 to 3 in app.component.ts. We can see the comparison made on all the three objects. Hope this explanation helps to understand how objects are compared and how the compareStatus function returns true or false. Let me go to the SelectControlValueAccessor documentation and go to the example specified in the bottom of this article. Here we can see the implementation of compare function. Whatever we have implemented as nested if conditions can also be implemented in a single line like this using tertiary operator. This approach can also be used within the compare status function if we want the function to be implemented in a single line. Hope all these explanations help you understand how to implement compare function that helps to customize comparison of objects and make the specific option selected in the select drop-down list. Let me summarize the changes to be done. In app.component.html, include ng model with two-way data binding for select element pointing to user.status. In the select element, include the compare function using compareWith. In app.component.ts, include this function definition. After the changes, save and check if the status drop-down list is pre-selected. With this fix, we are completing the implementation of update profile page. With this video, I am concluding the learning on template-driven form. There are some advanced topics regarding template-driven form that I have not covered yet. It is possible to implement our own custom validation using directives, and it is also possible to implement form validation based on multiple fields. For example, if we have start date to be older than end date, this involves validation between two fields. This as well can be implemented using custom validation directives. As these are advanced topics, I am not covering it as part of this course. If possible, separate videos on these topics will be included later. From the next video onwards, we will start learning reactive forms.